Hello, and welcome to this special supplementary episode of Grand Final History, where we review the fifth decade of the VFL from 1937 to 1946. We'll have a look at the trends, issues, significant incidents, and oddities over the last 10 years, before we start on episode 51 for 1947. If you haven't listened to the last 10 episodes, this might save you some time. Or maybe treat it as an introduction to the decade before you get into the details of each episode. If you're a regular listener, you might enjoy this review and analysis of the overarching themes, or you can go to the next episode. It's your choice. The VFL's fifth decade from 1937 to 1946 was a time of the Depression, war, farewells and returns. It was a time of change where football had to find its way to keep going as Australia faced unprecedented challenges. It was a decade that took hundreds of thousands of Australians away from their homes and out into parts of the world that many had never known existed. At the same time, hundreds of thousands of Americans visited Melbourne, bringing new ideas as well as chocolate, jeep and nylon stockings. Things would never go back to the way they were. While the worst of the Depression was over by the late 1930s, inner Melbourne, the home of most VFL clubs, was still a place of high unemployment, overcrowded homes, hunger and poverty. For many VFL players, the weekly match payment was essential for keeping families in a home and getting food onto their table. A 1937 newspaper article shared the struggles of one ex-VFL footballer who would go without meals so his children could eat, scrounge for wood to provide some heat, and his never-ending search for work. It was a desperate time for many. And if the Depression wasn't bad enough, 1937 saw an outbreak of a polio epidemic that stopped some suburban football games, kept kids away from watching football games in crowds, and brought fear to every parent who could do nothing but hope in an era before vaccinations would bring protection. The overarching influence for this decade was obviously the Second World War, but there was also the war between the VFA and the VFL. Let's start with the battle between the two football bodies. The Depression years had been especially tough on the association clubs, and by the late 1930s there were real fears that the VFA could collapse, with several clubs unable to pay their bills. Rather than fade away, the association, under the inspirational leadership of President J.J. Liston and Secretary Russell Kean Cohen, went on the attack. They did not look to the VFL for support and to be under its control. Instead, they developed a strategy to grow, a strategy that involved a more attractive version of the game to gain more spectators, which would, in time, allow it to deal with the VFL as an equal body. While the VFL's inner suburban clubs were well served by public transport and households, the VFA's outer suburban clubs had the territory that was growing in population. The demographic trends were with the association, if they could stay in business. The mood of the association is best summed up by a statement from Russell Kean Cohen, the VFA secretary, who said, "The association devised the Australian game and introduced every enduring benefit. The League, which is the rebellious child of the association, has only brought in profit and litigation." The VFA rule changes were designed to open the game up, create more movement, and hopefully reduce some of the ever-present violence that was keeping some spectators away. The most radical change was to allow throwing the ball, but there were other innovations, such as the downfield free kicks and a 10-yard penalty for time wasting after a free kick. There was even talk of a new VFA club playing out of the centrally located Olympic Park, opposite the MCG, where the Amy Park is today. As well as the new rules, VFA clubs were willing to spend big money on attracting stars from the VFL. The league threatened legal action against players who moved without a clearance, claiming the signed registration forms tied players to approved leagues. But the VFL never followed through. The legal advice was, even in the 1930s, that this would be seen as a restraint of trade, as was proven decades later in the 1980s. The first big-name player to move was South Melbourne's champion and sometimes Australian Test player, Laurie Nash. He went to Camberwell in 1939. Bob Pratt, who had kicked a record 150 goals in a single season, went to Coburg in 1940. Ron Todd, Collingwood's goal-kicking sensation, the successor to Dick Lee and Gordon Coventry, went to Williamstown. His portrait was turned to the wall, with Jock McHale declaring, "That is what we do to traitors." In 1941, Des Fothergill, the reigning Brownlow medalist and winner of the Copeland Trophy, also left Collingwood to join Ron Todd at Williamstown. And there were plenty more, not counting those who were rumoured to be leaving at different points of time. There was serious talk about Jack Dyer coaching Yarraville, but that one fell through. It all created fear for club administrators and confusion for supporters, and helped build interest in the VFA clubs, which led to bigger crowds. The strategy, led by Liston and Kean Cohen, was making progress. But, sadly for the VFA, the real war destroyed their momentum. With Australia threatened by Japan in 1942, there were only enough players available for one football competition in Melbourne, and that was a reduced VFL. A gentleman's agreement allowed available VFA players to move to VFL clubs on the promise that they would return to the VFA when it resumed. By 1944, the VFA was setting up to return, and there were serious meetings and much work on a potential merger with the VFL. A two-tier competition with conditional promotion and relegation was proposed, but the association did not see the deal as a meeting of equals, and the merger never happened. The VFA returned in 1945, and the animosity between the two organisations would continue. The real war, the Second World War, started in September 1939, on the eve of the VFL finals. The 1940 season commenced almost as normal. While there was some discussion on whether footy should continue, the consensus was that it was good for morale, and unless conditions significantly changed, it should continue. Some men enlisted, compulsory military training was introduced, and some went off to the war. Crowds began to fall. More players were in service in 1941, and clubs began to have trouble selecting teams with confidence. Players could not always get leave on Saturdays, and more men were away. In 1942, conditions changed significantly. Australia was stunned by the speed of the Japanese advance. The fall of Singapore and the fighting in New Guinea meant that the war was at the country's doorstep. Australia, at the start of 1942, was in a state of shock. Curtin turned to the USA for support, despite Australia's long ties to Britain. Capturing the moment in words, the Prime Minister said, "The ordinary way of life has gone. No longer will the government appeal. It will order and direct." More men and women enlisted. Everything was at the government's demand. Even binoculars had to be handed in to be assessed for military purposes. Women joined men in the workforce, and those who had not enlisted could find themselves working in essential industries, such as ammunition and aircraft factories and more. Americans arrived in their thousands, and VFL grounds, including the MCG, were assigned for military duties. It was not clear whether the 1942 season could be held, but eventually, with clubs sharing and changing grounds, the season started. Footscray was at Yarraville in 1942, and St Kilda used Toorak Park for 1942 and 43, then sharing the Junction Oval with South Melbourne until the end of 1946. Richmond shared Punt Road with Melbourne until late 1946, and South had a couple of seasons at Princes Park, before returning, south of the Yarra, to go to the Junction Oval. Enlisted players would turn up for games when they could get leave, and many men played after working 12-hour shifts in wartime factories, and only a few could get to training. The VFA, along with suburban and country leagues, were suspended. The Brownlow was put on hold. Geelong had to suspend its operations for 1942 and 43, given the restrictions on travel. Crowds plummeted, but VFL footy did continue. It was that gentleman's agreement allowing VFA players to transfer to the VFL clubs until the VFA could resume operations that meant there were enough players for the VFL to continue, but not for the likes of Pratt, Nash, Fothergill, Todd, and others like them who had left the VFL without a clearance. The world may be at war. The clubs might be struggling to put a team on the field, but leaving without a clearance was still not forgiven. With the MCG taken over by the military, the finals were played at Princes Park in 1942 and 43. There were real challenges in getting the crowds to the ground on the tram system, especially in 1942, so the Junction Oval was tried in 1944. Ironically, that year the tram situation was worse, with a tram strike called on Grand Final day, but people either caught the train to St Kilda or walked from the city along St Kilda Road. Plenty of Fitzroy supporters then walked all the way back to the Brunswick Street Oval after the game. But that was made easier, because you can walk for miles when you've won the premiership. Not such a happy trip home for Richmond supporters that year. The switch back to Princes Park in 1945 was driven by a belief that it could hold more people. It also had a bigger grandstand, which meant more higher-priced tickets could be sold. The trams still struggled to carry all the people there and away. Whether it was a change back to Princes Park or the end of the war, the switch worked. While 43,000 at the Junction Oval in 1944 was similar to the crowds at Princes Park in 1942 and 43, the 1945 Grand Final had 63,000 people squeezed into Princes Park. No wonder the trams struggled. Outside the real war, and the war between the VFL and the VFA, there was plenty happening in the fifth decade of the VFL. Now, decades later, the VFA would make Sunday football their own, but regular Sunday games in Melbourne first occurred in 1941. These exhibition games were to raise patriotic funds. They were condemned by some church leaders as desecrating the Sabbath. 20,000 people clearly did not mind desecrating the Sabbath when they turned up to Victoria Park to watch an unofficial Victorian state team take on a team representing the rest. Both teams were made up of a mix of VFA and VFL players, with all the money raised going to patriotic causes. The VFL was not keen on these Sunday games, but did not want to be seen as opposing patriotic fundraising efforts. By 1942, Sunday games were being played by teams from various branches of the military services and defence factories. For those working extended shifts in defence industries, Sundays were often the only time they got to see football played. Many VFL players would play with their club on Saturday and then with their services team on Sundays. Not an ideal arrangement, but some feared they would not get leave to play on Saturdays if they did not represent their service team on Sundays. Others saw it as their opportunity to do their bit for the war by helping to raise funds. The League supported the Sunday services competition by supplying equipment and umpires. With all the American forces based in Melbourne, there was plenty of sporting exchanges, with baseball games, kicking competitions, and even a gridiron game played on the hallowed MCG in 1943. Local spectators were not that impressed by the American code. Former Richmond and Melbourne Secretary Percy Page made an early call for Americanising Australian football, with more players on the bench and unlimited interchange, as well as allowing non-playing coaches to go onto the field to talk to players. If you think the modern-day administrators are introducing too many American-style innovations, perhaps blame Percy Page and his call to Americanise the game way back in 1942. A unique combined version of the Australian and American football codes called OSTUS was played in 1943. A number of exhibition games were played between leading local teams and teams made up of VFL players taking on American service sides. The Americans did surprisingly well, and there was talk of taking the game to the USA, but it did not make it past the war. There is video of Ostis on YouTube, and if you want to see how the Australian game would look with an American football and American-style throw passing, check it out. The class of 1925 began to make an impression in this fifth decade of VFL football. North Melbourne, Footscray and Hawthorn had all defected from the VFA in 1925. Footscray was the first club to make it to the finals in 1938, returning in 1942, 44 and 46. Hawthorn almost made it to the finals in 1943, missing out in the last game of the season when a 1-point loss left them short. Even a draw would have been good enough to get them into the Final Four that year, but they missed out. They would have to wait a bit longer before they made their first finals game. North Melbourne had their first visit to finals football in 1944 and would continue to challenge in the coming decade. The class of 25 were making their presence felt in the VFL, but these three former association teams still had yet to win a final, let alone make a grand final. Their time would come. While in the VFA, Camberwell and Sandringham, who had both joined the association in 1925, replacing two of those defecting clubs, both played in the 1946 Grand Final, with Sandy winning the VFA flag. There were a number of rule changes, innovations and developments in the VFL's fifth decade. Let's have a look at some of the coaching innovations first. Reg Hickey at Geelong took on a lot of the techniques pioneered by Collingwood veteran coach Jock McHale, but added more focus on running and fitness, as well as practising specific matchday situations. Geelong won the 1937 flag. Carlton, under new captain coach and former South Melbourne player Brighton Diggins, followed Hickey's approach and introduced exercises and gym routines led by a Melbourne University physical trainer, Herbert Truman. They went on to win the 1938 flag. Melbourne followed by employing a Danish exercise expert in 1939 to improve flexibility and muscles. One veteran declared they had done all that at school and he wanted players, not acrobats. Melbourne won the next three premierships, and the use of training specialists and warm-up exercises became the norm at most clubs. There were some key rule changes in this decade. For example, in 1939, there was a return to boundary throw-ins rather than a free kick against the last team to touch the ball. Also in 1939, dropping the ball when tackled was outlawed. Players would have to kick or handball when tackled. It did not solve the problem of the holding the ball, holding the man decisions. Maybe nothing ever will. At the end of the decade, the downfield free kick was introduced, after the VFA had pioneered it almost 10 years earlier, and a second substitute player, the 20th man, was added to the team. Radio broadcasting continued to grow in importance in this fifth decade, with more matchday broadcasts and evening shows during the week. Country leagues wanted restrictions on VFL game broadcasts being relayed on country radio stations. They feared crowd losses at their games if people stayed home to listen to VFL games from Melbourne. The broadcast deals were still managed on a club-by-club basis, with revenue share being split between the football club and the cricket clubs. Radio stations tried to get exclusive deals at grounds, and sometimes broadcasting was done with commentators located in adjacent properties until a deal could be struck. There was the first mention of a more dangerous broadcast technology at a league delegates meeting in 1937, when North Melbourne's John Meare raised the issue of television broadcasts, saying they would be more detrimental than radio. It will be another 10 years before television starts to make an impact, but John Meare was clearly keeping up with the developing technology. I'm not going to list all the Brownlow medalists for the fifth decade, and it was on hold from 1942 to 45 given that Geelong was out of the competition and many players were on active service. However, the 1940 Brownlow vote resulted in an extraordinary situation where Collingwood's Des Fothergill and South Melbourne's Herbie Matthews both received the same number of 3, 2 and 1 votes, meaning that they could not be split on a countback. The VFL struck replica medals for each player, and they would eventually both get their genuine Brownlow medals when the league awarded retrospective Brownlows to all tied results in 1989. The original 1940 Brownlow was retained by the VFL, and, after disappearing at one point into a cupboard at the Docklands office, it is now on display again. In the modern era, we were all familiar with our club nicknames. It was in this decade where some clubs first selected their mascot name, although not all stuck. Checker Hughes called Melbourne the Red Demons in a Sporting Globe article the year before this fifth decade started in 1936, and in the following years the name evolved to the Demons, a big improvement on their former nickname, the Fuchsias. Fitzroy decided to use the Gorillas nickname in 1937, but then rejected the Gorillas in 1940 when they decided it had not brought them any luck. They would continue to be called the Maroons, or the Maroons, depending on your pronunciation, before eventually becoming the Lions in many years to come. Essendon became the Bombers in 1940, with the nearby Essendon Airport and the obvious wartime connection acting as a catalyst. Hawthorn had previously used the none too inspiring nickname of the Mayblooms, being the month that hawthorn flowers bloom, in England that is. Roy Kazali took over as coach in 1942, and he knew it had to change. He did not ask the committee's permission, he just told the players before a game in 1943 that they were now the Hawks, and the name was adopted quickly by supporters and players alike. The Southern Stand of the MCG opened in 1936. This meant that crowds for grand finals in the early years of this fifth decade of the VFL grew dramatically. There were 96,486 people at the 1938 Grand Final between Carlton and Collingwood. With the disruptions of the Second World War and the loss of the MCG until 1946, that figure would not be topped until the next decade. However, it's worth noting that in 1946, a drawn semi-final delayed the VFL Grand Final by 1 week. This meant that the VFA and the VFL played their premiership matches on the same day. Typically, the association had played their grand final a week after the VFL to avoid the big matches clashing. In 1946, the two grand finals attracted a combined crowd of 110,000 people, enjoying a true festival of football in Melbourne. Reserve seats for finals were introduced in 1937. You had to go to the Allen's music store in the city to book your seat. There was not great demand early on, but by 1946, the reserve section for the grand final sold out on the Tuesday morning before the big game. If you were too late, you just had to line up on the day, getting in early to get a good seat. Once you had your seats, the tradition of standing to sing the national anthem before final games started in 1940 as a patriotic tribute to the war effort and those serving. God Save the King, or Queen, would continue to be played at every finals match. From the mid-1970s until its last rendition in 1983, God Save the Queen did have to share with Advance Australia Fair, but that's for future episodes. Let's focus on some of the players now. One of the giants of the game left the VFL at the start of this fifth decade. Gordon Coventry retired after the 1937 season on 306 games, the first VFL player to break the 300-game mark, and 1,299 goals, a record that stood until Tony Lockett topped it in the 1999 season. Coventry kicked 72 goals in his last season. As we discussed earlier, a number of players left the VFL to play in the VFA. Many returned to VFL football in 1945 and 46. The league declared that the 3-year bans had been served while the VFA had been suspended. It also made the logical decision that services football was not going to be counted as another breach of the VFA rules. Players like Pratt, Fothergill, Nash and others were back with the league. One who did not return was the sensational full forward Ron Todd. The breach with Collingwood was too bitter to be mended. He returned to Williamstown and kicked many more goals. Collingwood supporters could only dream of what might have been if he'd been wearing Magpie colours in those post-war seasons. Sadly, there were those like Ron Barassi Sr., Bluey Truscott, Sid Anderson and Harold Ball, all who had played in one or more of Melbourne's hat-trick of premierships, or were killed during the war. Many more VFL players would either be killed or not able to return to the game they loved due to injuries and time served in the war. However, let's look at two examples that will serve to tell the story of all who did make it back to the game. Bobby Mullinger had played 4 games for South Melbourne in 1939 and 40. He was captured in Singapore and survived the brutality of the Changi prison camp and the Burma Railroad. He made it back to play the first 2 games of the 1946 season with South Melbourne. Max Piggott enlisted for the Army before he got a chance to play league football. Released by the Army eventually in 1946, he played 1 game for suburban club South Districts before being selected to play for South Melbourne Reserves the very following week. Then he impressed the selectors so much, he was chosen to make his debut the following week as full forward playing against St Kilda, playing on fellow serviceman, RWAF veteran and Australian cricketer Keith Miller. Max Piggott had gone from park football to VFL in 3 weeks. What could he have done if the war had not interrupted his career, like it did for so many others? On a lighter note, the 5th decade also saw one of the best kept secrets in the VFL's history. Not a player transfer, not a surprise sacking of a coach, nor a challenge to a committee by a reform group who was going to lead their club to success. Possibly the biggest secret in the VFL was the infamous Phantom Reserves game between Geelong and St Kilda. It was the last game of the season in 1945, originally scheduled for the Junction Oval and switched to the Burnley Oval in Richmond. No spectators, torrential rain, bitterly cold wind, and no impact on the finals. And the pub was warm and dry. The only journalist for this reserves game was from the Geelong Advertiser, and he was encouraged to participate in the scheme. The 2 coaches made sure the umpires were part of the deal too. Perhaps they did not have to pay for any of the drinks that afternoon. The match report in the Geelong Advertiser described a draw, with a point scored on the last kick of the day after the bell rang. Meanwhile, all the players were warm and dry in a local pub, and some even went off to watch theatre shows in the city. All was kept secret for many, many years. Eventually, some rumours started floating about, but it was not until 2014, nearly 70 years later, that the details were revealed. Fortunately, no one got into any trouble after all that time. Let's have a look at the grand finals over the VFL's 5th decade. A decade where grand finals reached the heights of the best game ever played in 1937 to the depths of the most violent grand final in VFL history in the 1945 Bloodbath. It was a decade that had something for many teams, but not for the Collingwood machine. They had won 6 premierships in the previous decade, but Collingwood would never see that type of success again. The Magpies would play in the first 3 grand finals of the decade and lose each one. They struggled in the war years, with many players enlisting and some defecting to the VFA before eventually making preliminary finals in 1945 and 46. But for the first time ever, a decade passed without Collingwood winning a premiership. Geelong won their 3rd premiership with the Reg Hickey-led team, defeating Collingwood in 1937, in a game described by almost all observers as the greatest game ever played. Collingwood's president, Harry Curtis, congratulated the Cats, and even he said, "Why can't we have such games every week?" Carlton's premiership win over Collingwood in 1938, in Brighton Diggins' first season as captain coach, was a drought breaker. The Blues had not won a grand final since 1915. Melbourne had been perennial easy beats until Richmond's premiership coach Frank Checker Hughes switched from Punt Road to the MCG in 1933. He turned over the list, coined a new mascot name. Demons was a big improvement on the Fuchsias. Although some supporters still cheered on the Redlegs. Melbourne won their premiership in 1939, consigning Collingwood to their third grand final loss in a row. The 1939 grand final was also the first time the substitute umpire took over during the game, when field umpire Alan Coward collided with some players in the second quarter and fractured his elbow. Emergency umpire William Blackburn took over for the remainder of the game. Melbourne won the next two premierships against Richmond and Essendon, giving them the hat-trick and giving Checker Hughes 4 premierships to his name. They had been the dominant team, but from 1942, both Melbourne and Collingwood dropped away as the loss of players to war service cut deep. Essendon's Dick Reynolds had been a star since his debut season in 1933, winning the first of 3 Brownlow medals in his second season. He took over as playing coach in 1939, and success for the club followed. They were runners-up in 1941, the third team beaten by the dominant Melbourne. However, they won the 1942 premiership, defeating Richmond, and were runners-up again in the 1943 rematch with the Tigers. Those 3 grand finals in a row, with 1 premiership, was then topped off with the 1946 premiership defeat of Melbourne when the grand final returned to the MCG. The Bombers played in 4 grand finals for 2 premierships in the VFL's 5th decade. We'll be seeing plenty of them in the episodes to come. Richmond made their mark under Jack Dyer, Captain Blood leading the team to 4 grand finals in 1940, 1942, 1943 and 1944. But there was only that 1 premiership when they defeated Essendon in 1943. Fitzroy had been the dominant VFL team in the first 2 or 3 decades of the VFL, but they had lost their way after their 1922 premiership. Their last grand final had been in 1923. However, under the leadership of captain coach Fred Hewson, they were back to finals football in 1943 and won the 1944 premiership at the Junction Oval. It was a happy hunting ground for Fitzroy, who had won grand finals there in 1898 and 1899, the only club ever to win VFL premierships at that ground. The 1944 win over Richmond would also be the last time 2 captain coaches led teams against each other in a grand final. But it's not the last time a captain coach would win a premiership. You can work that one out for yourselves. It is many episodes into the future. Sadly for Fitzroy, it would be their last grand final and their last premiership. The club eventually merged with the Brisbane Bears after the VFL's 100th season, and more success followed for what would become the Brisbane Lions. Carlton won a second grand final in 1945, defeating South Melbourne in a game which is forever remembered as the infamous Bloodbath. South Melbourne had a good season, and some players had made big bets on a win in the grand final. Carlton had been low on the ladder in the middle of the season, but come home with a rush. They had beaten Collingwood in the preliminary final, regarded by many as an even more violent game than the infamous Bloodbath. The Blues skipper, Bob Chitty, led his team through the game and in the fights, and even though he was knocked out cold by Laurie Nash, he still managed to kick a goal in the final quarter. There was the usual outrage after the game, and many players were suspended. But nothing really changed. There were calls for an order-off rule, but it never happened. That is just how football was played at times during the 5th decade. We will leave this review of the 5th decade here. At the start of the 1946 season, the VFL celebrated a 50th anniversary Jubilee dinner, and one of the guests of honour was Edwin Wilson, who was the league's original secretary. He had seen the competition grow from an 8-team organisation to a 12-club powerhouse. He'd been there at the very start, helping the league save money on postage by delivering the minutes and other documents to club secretaries himself. Now the VFL was the leading football competition in the country. According to his successor, VFL Secretary Mike McBrien, the game of Australian football was a gigantic industry, generating over £250,000 per annum into the economy. Although, as impressive as that number sounds, McBrien's claim exactly matches the amount stated by Australian Football Council member and VFL delegate Bob Rush in 1937. Perhaps like McBrien was copying Bob's notes, and nobody noticed. Regardless, the league had survived a challenging decade, keeping the game alive during the Second World War and weathering the attacks from the VFA. The post-war economic boom was coming, the population was going to increase, and the VFL had set its foundations and was ready for the next 10 years and more. Grand Final History will be back with the next episode covering 1947, the 51st season of the VFL. If you've enjoyed Grand Final History, please leave a review wherever you get your podcast from, and remember to follow. The more goals we kick, the easier it is for others to find the podcast. If you have questions or want to leave feedback, please email me at info@grandfinalhistory.au or check out the grandfinalhistory.au website or Facebook or Twitter or Blue Sky for more Grand Final History.